Good day. I'm glad to welcome everybody back to our lectionary Bible study. We will be looking at two texts today. One, the middle section of Romans 8, and then also another parable from Matthew 13. Last week, we looked at Matthew 13, the first part of that chapter, and we also looked at chapter 8 in Romans last week, and it was the very first part of that. So I'd like for us to begin with the Romans text today. We begin in Romans 8:12, and what Paul is doing is he's talking to this church that he has never visited yet, but he is trying to set out a more or less complete theology for these people so they understand what it means to be a Christian. And so you'll notice that even though he doesn't use explicit Trinitarian nomenclature or language here, he does talk about the ideas of the Trinity. He talks about God in chapter 8 quite a bit. He talks about Jesus Christ quite a bit, and he also talks about the Spirit or the Holy Spirit. And in fact, this whole chapter of chapter 8 is about what life in the Spirit looks like. And he talks about the future of glory and the love of Jesus Christ as it reflects the love of God and so forth. So at the very beginning, I want to back up to verse 11, right before our text starts. It says, "If the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead," that is the Spirit of God or Yahweh, "dwells in you," the Spirit of God dwells in you, "then He who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also, through the Spirit that dwells in you." In other words, this idea of Spirit is life-giving, so that as people become Christians and worship God and Jesus, animated by the Holy Spirit, they are full human beings. They're complete, they're healthy, and they stand in a state of salvation. Now, one of the things that Paul does, and I'm sure he does this on purpose, although he's not explicit about it, is that if you remember the very first chapter or two of Genesis, as we see God creating the world and then also fashioning all the animals and eventually human beings, you will notice that God's Spirit is hovering over the form of the deep. And it's that Spirit hovering over it, or the wind of God. The Hebrew term is ruach. The Greek term is pneuma. It's the Spirit of God, the breath of God, that is going to separate the land from the sea, and then eventually do all of the steps in chapter 1 that lead to our creation as we know it now. Chapter 2, it's a little bit different creation story, but it is another story where the Spirit of God is moving. And so here in chapter 8 of Romans, I believe that Paul is trying to help us understand that as God works in human beings, He makes us, like the original creation, a new creation. And you will see that kind of language in some of what Paul is saying to us. So, after he talks about God's Spirit dwelling in us, then he says, "So then," and it's a way to say consequently, or because of this prior reason, then we move on to the next implications of having the Spirit dwell in us. We are debtors, not to the flesh. Remember, the flesh is the thing that it's a manner of living that is selfish, unloving, closed off, non-personal, non-relational, to live according to the flesh. For if you have, for if you live according to the flesh, you will die. You remember that sin leads to death. But, he says, if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, that is, our members that seem to wander from the correct and righteous and justified path, then you will live. And so, sin or the flesh offers us death, but Spirit gives us life. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. It's the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, that makes us children of God. And then he tells these Romans, which, by the way, he's never met yet, for you did not receive a spirit of slavery or servanthood to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption, which means that God has made us God's children. When we cry, Abba, Father, means something along the lines of Daddy. It is the very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if in fact we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. Now, there's a lot to this, but basically what it means is that if we are able to have a relationship with God that we can call God Daddy or Abba or Father, then what that means is that we are alive in the Spirit and that God has adopted us as children. And if we become children, then God's legacy, which we could interpret as the promise of God that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, then we could understand that we too are heirs of that same sort of promise, which is to be God's justified and sanctified people. And then if that all happens, then we will be glorified with Jesus. And to be in glory means to be in God's glory. To be, it's like being in the shade. We move into a place of more comfort. In this way, it means the comfort of the Spirit, the comfort of salvation, the comfort of wholeness and wellness. Now, the next thing that Paul talks about, and this begins at verse 18 of chapter 8 of Romans, is talking about future glory. And Paul talks about sufferings because one of the things about Christians is if they are true to their vows, there will be things that cause them suffering. I've been in places where people would make disparaging remarks against an ethnic group or a racial group or a certain gender or somebody of a certain age. And whenever that happens, if we do not stand up for the person that is not present, then what we have done is refused to suffer on behalf of the truth or righteousness. As a pastor, I will occasionally hear somebody say something about a person in my congregation. They may not even be in the congregation, maybe just somebody from town. They will say something that is patently false about that person. And I try, if I can, to stand up and say, no, that's not right. You got your facts wrong. That is not true. And sometimes when we stand up for someone like that, we can suffer because our friends or our cohorts, they will say something disparaging about us standing up for another person. That is one way that we in the 21st century can suffer. People in the time of Paul and in the time that Romans is written probably suffered in a more physical way, but the idea is that we don't consider the sufferings of the present time worth comparing to the glory about to be revealed to us. In other words, our investment in God and in the love of Jesus makes us worthy of the glory that will be coming to us, and it will surpass anything that we can imagine. And then he says, for creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that creation itself will be set free from the bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of glory of the children of God. Basically what he's doing is he's talking about creation as an analogy to human beings. Like human beings decay, the older we get, our teeth start falling out, we can't walk too good, our hips hurt, our ankles hurt, our shoulder hurts, our elbows hurt, our fingers hurt, we get arthritis, we get sick, we don't sleep so well. You get the idea. And what Paul is saying is that creation itself suffers from that same sort of decay as do human beings. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. In other words, creation is trying to rebirth itself so that it comes closer to the original perfection that we saw in the Garden of Eden. And not only the creation, but we ourselves. And so he draws the analogy closer together. Who have the first fruits of the Spirit grown inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. In other words, when God adopts us, our bodies are redeemed. For in hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes in what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. And so this idea that Paul is talking about here is that that we have this faith in God and we have this hope in God, but we may not be able to see it like we do most things. But it's more like what Psalm 39 told us on Tuesday, which is that God is everywhere. He's outside, he's inside, he is redeeming us constantly. And that's what Paul is saying. Just because you don't see physically with your eyes God at work does not mean that God is not at work. And that should give us hope. Hope in God and hope in the future. Now our lesson from Matthew then is a parable that appears only in Matthew. You will remember last week we talked about the parable of the sower. A farmer went out to sow. That's what we were told. And we looked at it, and what was interesting about that particular parable was Jesus tells the parable, and then there's a little break in the action, and then the disciples get Jesus alone, and they ask him to explain the parable to them. And so he gives them something of an allegory. This part of the parable means this, that part of the parable means that, and he goes through it that way. It's very unusual for Jesus to explain his parables. Usually he just tells the parables. Now, I'm not going to swear to this, but I don't remember in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus ever explains a parable. Well, what's interesting is here in Matthew 13, Jesus explains two different parables. First, he tells a parable in verses 24 through 30, and then in verses 36 through 43, Jesus gives Jesus gives another allegory about the parable. This means this means that, and so forth. So let's take a look at this parable. We begin with the 24th verse of Matthew 13. This is called the parable of the weeds among the wheat. There are other names for it too. Wheat and tares is one that's very popular. Jesus put before them another parable. And so Matthew sets it up. He says, Jesus puts before them another parable. As if to say, listen to this, Jesus is going to tell another story. It's a dynamite story. You need to pay attention. You need to listen to it. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also as well. And the slaves of the householder, the servants of the householder came, and they said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? And the master answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No. In the gathering of the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest, and at the harvest, the time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat in my barn. Okay, that's the telling of the parable, not the explanation of it. But what's interesting here is that last week, when we talked about the sower went out to sow, that all the seed was good. And the negative things that happened to the seed were based on where it landed, on a path, in a thicket, and so forth. Here, you have good seed sown in presumably good soil, but you also have an enemy, and the enemy's not identified. Some people say it's the devil. Some people say it's one of the fellow's neighbors or his agricultural competitor. Who knows? That person comes and he sows bad seed or weeds among the good wheat that has already been sowed. Now, you got to know that in this particular parable, there's a time element involved, because I remember when I was in grade school and we would do little gardens in our second and third grade classes, and people would plant their seeds and they would just sit there and they would watch on the first day to see when it was going to grow. Well, sometimes it took a week, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 weeks. And so there's a period of time that even when the weeds and the wheat come up together, you can't tell one from the other because they're so small. But eventually, you will be able to see that there's some weeds and there is some wheat. And so the servants come back to the master and they say, should we, in essence, weed the field, get rid of all the weeds so that the tares or the wheat can grow and take all the nutrients and water from the soil and not share them with the weeds. Well, the master says you need to be careful about that idea, because in taking up the weeds, you may also remove some of the wheat, and that wouldn't be good. And of course, this whole parable is an analogy about the church, that there are good seed in the church, righteous, obedient people to the covenant with God. But they're also, some of them are slackers, some of them are just evil people that are in the church. And what we want to do is we want to get rid of those people that are the weedy people in the church. But notice what the master of the household says. No, because in taking the weeds out, you may also damage the wheat. And so, as an analogy of the church of Jesus Christ, what this says is let everything grow together, and at the time of the harvest, then God will instruct the reapers to take care of the weeds, to bind them and to burn them. And Matthew has some serious threats that are not veiled in any way whatsoever. The threat is that if you end up to be a weedy person in the church or just in life in general, then what's going to happen to you is you're going to be bound and burned at the final days and the consummation of human history and Yom Yahweh, the day of the Lord, when everything will be rectified and fixed by God Himself. So we get down there and we have the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast right after this parable of the wheat and tares. And then Jesus tells them about why He uses parables. And then verse 36 says, then Jesus left the crowds and went into the house, and His disciples approached Him, saying, explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. And in a sense, He does the same thing with this parable that He did with the first one of a sower went out to sow. He is asked by the disciples to explain the parable, and He only explains the parable when He's with the disciples alone. And so Jesus answered, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, which is another way of saying the Messiah or Jesus Himself. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. So you get the analogy part of this allegory, where one thing represents another. Now, there are many parables that Jesus tells that are not allegories, but the one that He told last week about the sower went out to sow, and this one about the wheat and the tares, or the weeds of the field, there's a direct correspondence between each element in the parable. And so in that sense, it is an allegory, a one-for-one correspondence of meaning. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. That is, when human history comes to a close and God decides to stop this experiment that we call the world and life itself. The Son of Man will send His angels, and they will collect out of His kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. After that happens, then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And then the final warning. Anyone with ears, listen. In other words, if you can hear this warning, then pay attention. That's what this particular parable is all about. And what it does for us, I think, is it explains to us why we should not be busy running around the church or even in our society trying to decide who's an insider with God and who's an outsider with God. Because when we do such things, then we damage one another. One of the problems that all pastors have is that there are always church members who look down on certain kinds of sins of people and say, we need to get rid of those people because they're sinners. Well, the real truth of the matter is this parable says, let everybody grow together, and at the end, let God sort it all out. That's in essence what this text says. It says we can't be responsible for the faithfulness and the covenant commitment of other people, but we can be responsible for our obedience and our covenant commitment. We can make decisions for ourselves. It's very difficult to make decisions for other people. And if you've ever had teenage children, you understand what that means. You can wish the best for them. You can give them a lot of recommendations, but when they get away from you, they will be making their own decisions because we cannot make decisions for them when they get to a certain age. I'd like to thank everybody for being with us today, and I look forward to seeing you on Sunday morning via our video and Facebook and all the rest of that stuff that have our worship services. So thank you very much.